If I told you there is a prophecy so terrifying that it spelled the doom of a kingdom and left the world forever changed, would you listen? This is not a thriller or a modern conspiracy. It is an ancient revelation recorded in a book that has unsettled kings and comforted exiles across millennia. Not fiction, not mere legend, but a sustained encounter with God and history. Daniel versus Babylon is the story of a man living at the center of imperial power, who witnessed empires rise and fall, and who received visions that cut through political arrogance to declare a divine verdict. Picture a young Hebrew taken from his city, the smell of smoke and dust of a burned temple still in the air, brought to the glittering courts of a foreign capital, where loyalty could be bought with a banquet. Picture a voice that speaks truth in corridors, where the loudest voices are those of advisors and officials. In this video, we will walk through the life of Daniel from exile to exaltation, the tests of fidelity that carved his character, the night visions that revealed the pattern of empires, the public confrontations that unmasked false gods, and the apocalyptic scenes that point toward God as the sovereign author of history. Along the way, you will see how faith in private decisions becomes public testimony, how prayer shapes destiny, and how a terrifying prophecy can be a doorway to hope. Stay with me to the end, because the last scene reframes how you see your present storms. Now let us enter the tense, smoky, brilliant world where Daniel stands against Babylon and hears the future spoken. To understand the force of what Daniel confronted, we must set the scene in history and locate the man in his world. The time was a season of national catastrophe. Judah had been conquered, the temple looted, families torn apart, and carried as captives into the heart of the empire known for its hanging gardens and for its appetite for tribute. This was not vague antiquity, but a political reality attested by inscriptions and ruins. Young men of noble blood were chosen for training in royal service. They were stripped of names and national rights and instructed in the literature and language of their captors. Daniel was among them. He was likely in his late teens when he was taken, a person who carried the memory of liturgy and the smell of sacrificial smoke, who had sat by the ruined altar and listened to elders who told stories of covenant and promise. In this setting, training meant learning foreign letters and food that symbolized alliance. It also meant a daily pressure to trade identity for comfort. The court glittered with gold and fine cloth, with the clatter of dishes and the hush of court music. Historians note that such assimilation programs aimed to create loyal officials. Yet Daniel kept his inner altar. He preserved the memory of Yahweh in the pattern of his days. He was not a distant prophet in a cave, but a young man at a table, in classrooms, in the royal service where his integrity would be tested. The political stage included palace intrigue, eunuchs who balanced loyalty between king and God, scribes who whispered counsel, and priests who remembered Jeremiah and the warnings he had spoken. Sensory details matter because they tell us how faith was exercised. You can imagine the taste of rich stews seasoned with foreign herbs, the clink of bronze goblets at court banquets, the heavy perfume of incense meant to honor idols, the scratch of stylus on a clay tablet in the training hall, the heavy boots of a guard echoing down a colonnade. In this crucible, Daniel formed his convictions. He was neither naive nor sensational in his piety. His faith was practical and disciplined. He chose small acts of resistance that would have large consequences. This is the setting for the first tests that reveal character, and for the later visions that reveal God's control over empires. The first great test of fidelity was painfully ordinary and yet revolutionary in effect. Food on the king's table was not just nourishment, it was acceptance into the power structure. Refusal was a political statement. The scene opens with Daniel and 3 companions presented before the chief eunuch. The offer is elegant and insistent. The dialogue unfolds with a rhythm of pressure and resolve. Eunuch said, "Are you willing to abandon the diet of your fathers to partake of the king's provision?" Daniel replied, "Our bodies will not be instruments of denial to God." Eunuch said, "There is danger. The diet program is part of the training, and refusal will be noticed." Daniel said, "We ask only a trial of 10 days, and the food will show who is wise." Eunuch said, "How will I present this to the palace?" Daniel said, "If you test us, let the steward give us pulse and water to eat." Eunuch said, "It is unusual." Daniel said, "Let our faces be sharper and our minds clearer, and you will judge." Eunuch said, "Very well, I will risk this and observe." There is a back and forth of persuasion and caution, totaling 8 exchanges that make the stakes vivid. Sensory description saturates the scene. You can hear the scrape of wooden bowls, the whisper of fabric as garments shift, the faint sweetness of figs, the iron tang of water from the cistern, the cool touch of clay cups on young palms. The trial is simple yet decisive. 10 days pass. Observers report brighter faces and keener minds. The officials who had expected the youths to be weakened are surprised. Daniel and his companions are found to be physically and intellectually superior, and they are promoted in the training program. This early episode is instructive because it ties daily discipline to divine blessing. It is a practical theology that says small acts of faith, framed by prayer and restraint, yield influence within the halls of power. The pattern of private fidelity producing public fruit sets the tone for the larger dramatic confrontations to come. The court soon produces a dream that will expose the limits of human wisdom and highlight Daniel's gift to interpret under the Lord. The king wakes in the night, shaken by an image that dissolves his sleep. He summons the wise men, yet none can tell him the dream and its meaning. The scene is tense and ceremonial. The king demanded truth and execution hovered. Advisors pleaded and promised, but without substance. Daniel was informed and called to stand before the royal presence. The conversation begins with the king asking what the dream was and the wise men confessing ignorance. Daniel then asks for time to seek mercy through prayer. The dialogue there stretches through 8 exchanges where Daniel negotiates space for God to reveal. As Daniel prays, he recalls his people in exile, the humiliation they have endured, and he appeals to God for wisdom. The prayer itself is textured with sensory detail. The night air holds a chill. The oil lamps sputter, casting moving shadows on the palace wall. There is the soft rustle of a cloak as Daniel moves. The taste of dry bread in his mouth as fasting tightens his resolve. The smell of incense used to calm the anxious, and the palpable silence that precedes revelation. God answers with a vision, and grants Daniel not only the interpretation, but the dream itself for the king. Daniel describes a colossal statue, whose head was pure metal and whose feet were a mixture, and a stone cut without hands struck and broke the statue into pieces. Daniel interprets the metals as successive kingdoms, and the stone as a kingdom that the Lord will establish that endures and crushes worldly powers. The reaction of the king moves from rage to awe to an offer of reward. Daniel refuses gold, but asks respect for his God and wisdom to steer public affairs. This confrontation shows the sovereignty of God in revealing the future and establishes Daniel as a distinctive interpreter in the imperial court. At roughly 1/3 into this narrative, pause and reflect, because this is the moment for connection. If this story prompts you to think about a time you had to choose integrity over convenience, share it in the comments. Maybe begin your comment with, "My defining choice was," and offer a short sentence about what happened. Reading your experiences will help others know they are not alone and will guide future discussions here. Now back to the story where tension becomes public and miraculous. The test of open faith escalates when the king erects a massive image and commands homage. The mob-like gathering, the clang of brass, the blaze of torches, and the smell of heated metal create an atmosphere designed to overwhelm conscience. There is a decree that every official must bow. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse. Officials report, "Them and the king rages with vindictive pride." The conversation between the king and the 3 friends is electric. King said, "Who is this God who will deliver you from my hand?" Shadrach said, "Our God is able to save, and even if he does not, we will not serve your gods." King said, "You speak with insolence and defy my decree." Officials said, "These men must learn submission." Friend said, "We will not bow, because our worship belongs to Yahweh." King said, "Then you shall fall into the furnace." Friend said, "We trust God with our lives, and we do not fear flames." This is an 8-exchange encounter that balances royal menace with spiritual calm. The sensory layer in the furnace scene is vivid and abundant. You can see the heat shimmer above the coals. You can hear the roar as fuel is added. You can smell smoke and burning resin. You can feel the oven stones tremble under the guards' feet. You can taste the dust on your lips from the hurried march to the execution. When the friends are thrown into the fire, the spectacle becomes uncanny. The flames do not consume them. The king and his staff perceive a fourth figure walking with them, a presence radiant and unsinged. The visual effect is described with awe. The guards shielded their eyes from the brilliant light. Even the king staggered at the sight of intact garments and unmarred skin. The official testimony leads the king to praise the God of these men and to promote them. This scene demonstrates that public fidelity becomes prophetic witness. It also shows that the presence of God can be experienced as a sensory reality that convicts the strongest skeptic. Power corrupts and pride blinds. Nebuchadnezzar is not immune to this pattern. After a period of triumph, he dreams of a towering tree removed by divine decree, a symbol of his own humbling. His arrogance swells until he attributes greatness to himself rather than to God. The narrative describes his speeches in which he declares that he built the city, that his wisdom alone explains his success, and that no higher power restrains him. The scene where his heart is lifted is punctuated by the clink of cups at a banquet where he pronounces himself sovereign. The voice of God then moves with strange power. Nebuchadnezzar is stricken with a madness that pushes him to eat grass like an ox and to live outdoors. The sensory account is grotesquely intimate. You can hear the scrape of teeth on bitter stalks, smell the earth on his breath, feel the wind cool his hair, see his garments hung in tatters, and watch the slow erosion of dignity. Months pass outside the palace until his reason returns and he acknowledges the sovereignty of Yahweh. The confession that follows is both political and theological. He is restored to rule and praises God publicly. That restoration is not simple rehabilitation, but a narrative that places the king under divine judgment and mercy. Later, a sudden night scene shows handwriting on the palace wall in a festival of drunkenness, and a terrified king reads words that declare his doom. The handwriting is inexplicable, and the court is thrown into clamor. The dialogue around that moment involves wise men who cannot interpret the script, and then Daniel, who is called. The exchanges between Daniel and the king carry weight. King said, "You interpreted dreams before. Will you now read this writing?" Daniel said, "The inscription declares the end of your kingdom, because you have turned from God." King said, "Then let your counsel be heard." Daniel said, "Your kingdom is given to the Medes and Persians." The sound of the chambers freezes as the sentence is sealed. That night, the empire is invaded, and the prophecy is fulfilled. The arc from pride to judgment to historical fulfillment underscores the theme that human power is transient under the governance of God. Fidelity often becomes most visible in the private acts of public servants. One of the most famous tests is Daniel in the lion's den. Enemies of Daniel conspire by exploiting royal law. They trap him by a decree that forbids petition to any god or man other than the king for 30 days. Daniel continues his routine of prayer facing Jerusalem 3 times a day. He knows the risk but maintains his devotion. The conspirators watch and report him. The scene that follows is judicial and theatrical. Officials drag Daniel before the king, and with false warmth they say, "Your trust in laws outside the monarchy threatens the order." King said, "Daniel, you are a faithful man, to whom I gave great authority. Is this true?" Accusers said, "He prays contrary to your decree, and he must be punished." Daniel said, "My practice has been prayer to the God of heaven who answers." King said, "The law stands, and I must obey." Accusers said, "Put him into the den where he will learn." There are 8 to 10 exchanges in this courtroom drama that emphasize legalism used as a weapon. The sensory texture of the den itself is dark and damp, the stone rattle as the lion gate is closed, the metallic clang of the lid sealing the tomb-like space, the acrid smell of earth and lion breath, the roughness of the stones against a worried hand, the thin taste of dried bread left at the entrance that the monarch cannot bring himself to taste. The night is long. The king cannot sleep. At dawn he rushes to the den and calls with a voice hoarse from fear and hope. King said, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God been able to save you?" Daniel said, "O king, my God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and I was not harmed." The king rejoiced and issued a decree praising God. The conspirators received the punishment they intended for Daniel. This episode affirms that persistent prayer can elicit deliverance in the most dire circumstances, and that even legal structures can be redirected toward justice. As Daniel matured, he received visions that moved from personal deliverance to cosmic revelation. The late chapters present a series of apocalyptic images that are dense and dramatic. The vision of 4 beasts emerging from the sea evokes 4 empires, each distinct in ferocity and form. The first had features like a lion with wings, another like a bear, a third like a leopard with 4 heads, and a fourth dreadful with iron teeth and 10 horns. The sensory writing here is rich and unsettling. You can imagine the thunder of hooves, the slick sheen of scaled hide under moonlight, the stench of salt on breath rising from a chaotic sea, the metallic taste of fear in the mouth of a watcher, the chill of the divine courtroom described in the vision. Then comes the one like a little horn that speaks arrogantly and commits blasphemy, and the Ancient of Days who takes a throne of flames. Angels explain the vision to Daniel in calm expository exchange. Angel said, "These beasts are kingdoms that will rise." Daniel said, "What is the destiny of the arrogant horn?" Angel said, "He will be judged and his power taken away, and there will be a time and times and half a time." The interpretation spans several exchanges and situates the visions within an eschatological framework. There is an explicit link to later texts that speak of resurrection and final judgment. The language connects the ancient scenes to the New Testament imagery of the Son of Man and to later Christian eschatological hope. Yet the vision also offers pastoral consolation to those who suffer under oppressive regimes. The sovereignty of God is reiterated, reminding readers that earthly beasts are instruments under divine direction. Throughout all these encounters, the central theological thread remains: God is sovereign. Daniel receives this not as abstract doctrine, but as existential assurance. The prophecies that sound terrifying actually reveal that history is not random and that judgment ultimately serves divine justice and restoration. The practical application for us is direct. First, private fidelity matters. The small choices to pray, to refuse compromise, and to align with God over convenience form our character and prepare us for influence. Second, God can interrupt public life in unexpected ways. Third, prophetic warnings are both terrible and merciful because they call rulers and peoples to accountability. Ask yourself where you stand when culture demands compromise. Are you willing to risk comfort for conviction? What daily disciplines of prayer and integrity can you adopt this week that might alter your testimony in months to come? Consider also how you interpret public events. Do you see patterns of judgment and mercy or only chaos? These questions are not academic. They shape how we live in community. A note about historical and devotional balance. The book of Daniel mixes court history with symbolic visions. Some scholars debate authorship and dating, and others defend its eyewitness claims. What remains constant in the text is the insistence that God governs empires and that faithful people witness to that governance. Archaeology and ancient inscriptions corroborate certain details about kings and courts, and apocryphal editions such as the Prayer of Azariah provide liturgical texture that ancient communities used to process suffering. For practical study, examine both the Hebrew and the Greek traditions and consult careful commentaries that weigh historical evidence alongside theological significance. Epistolary closing with an epilogue that traces possible outcomes over time will help bring this ancient account into your own calendar. 1 month later, the immediate consequence of this story for a committed follower might be quieter than expected. You may not be publicly lauded or vindicated. Sometimes the first 30 days after a bold choice feel like a wilderness where no news comes and doubts whisper. In that space, keep prayer regular and memory attentive. 3 months later, the pattern begins to show. Habits have taken shape. People notice a steadier temper, a refusal to speak in anger, a dependable presence in a team or family. That is when reputation begins to shift, and when others may begin to ask the source of your consistency. 6 months later, the witness can change community practices. A leader who stood firm may be consulted about decisions. Quiet acts of integrity become institutionalized policies. For some, the long arc can even influence a culture beyond the immediate circle as justice reforms are initiated and as stories of deliverance circulate. The epilogue demonstrates that prophetic effect is rarely instantaneous, and yet it is durable. The terrifying prophecy that doomed a kingdom also taught nations to fear God and to measure power by a higher standard. The practical rhythm for the listener is simple. In 1 month, commit to a renewed prayer routine. In 3 months, invite accountability from a friend or mentor to maintain that practice. In 6 months, review how your choices have reshaped relationships and whether your witness has borne fruit in ways you could not have planned. If this narrative has touched you and given you courage, consider subscribing to explore more studies that combine careful history and practical devotion. Share this video with someone facing pressure to compromise, and write in the comments, "My defining choice was," and tell a short sentence of what you did. I will read some responses and reflect with you in upcoming episodes. Remember that Daniel stands not as a distant figure, but as an example of faith that assumes God is present, that prayer matters, and that even terrifying prophecies operate within the sovereignty of Yahweh. The story of Daniel versus Babylon calls us to steadfastness, to prayerful interpretation of history, and to hope in a God who rules the rise and fall of empires. Keep faith, choose courage, and trust that in ways seen and unseen, God is writing history with the lives of the faithful.